All right, so here's a cool strategy on how we can use simple tools to get the results that we're after. Okay, so Waddell had an issue of trying to tackle those little triangle bits that pop up onto the top of our dumpster. Well, don't forget our good old friend loop slice. Okay, loop slice can yield us some pretty interesting results. I just sliced that little loop there with a count of 2 with a mode of symmetry, and you can see the 2 edge loops that I gained. Those are the 2 guys right there. Now, check it out. This is actually kind of cool. Once we have those edge loops, we can move them into position, which is kind of neat. Okay.
I tried that, but there was like, the loop would keep going all around the mesh because the arm holders are
is part of it, right?
Yeah.
Is part of it.
I was sitting there thinking like it shouldn't. I feel like it shouldn't be looping around the whole.
Yeah.
I feel like there's a way to just get those edges right there. Right
Yeah, absolutely.
I didn't think of that. I was just like constantly fixated. Like there is a way.
Yeah. Okay, here's my dumpster, and I made it all one piece, and you should really look to do this whenever you can, but it's not necessarily necessary, because one of the things we get when we make it all one piece is the ability to gain loops, okay? And loop structure is an important element for 3D modeling. And ultimately, at the end of the day, what this is going to yield us is a structure that's very solid. It's editable, so we can very quickly go in and add detail, take detail away, okay? However, I understand, firsthand, it can be a challenge, especially if you don't have the structure set up, okay? Because if you look at mine, my loops go all the way around the mesh, okay?
Now I'm looking at it like, obviously it's not it wasn't that big of a deal that the fact that the loops went around the whole mesh. For some reason I was looking at it like, this does not look correct.
Not the end of the world, yeah. Not the end of the world. Not the end of the world if you look at the structure that I've crafted, okay? And this actually kind of segues into a point that I wanted to make a little bit later on, but it's not bad to start with a model like this that has loops that go all the way around the mesh during the construction phase. And I would say that this is a construction phase element, okay? Because it's easy to model with loops, right? Especially when working with symmetrical objects. We can almost guarantee that the left side is going to be similar to the right side when we're working with loops, okay? But at the end of the day, we can rip this entire model apart and downgrade the resolution to make it work for our scene.
So you mean like make this model for the only one, everything has to be a 1?
Doesn't have to be, but
I kind of separate the first by piece to piece, but
yeah, that's not a bad idea. Let me show you. This is where I would go next in this entire process. Okay. So we have this wonderful dumpster. It's looking pretty great. Everything's UV'd. But if we start counting all the polygons, I'm well over my budget just on the base of the dumpster itself. I'm at 536 polygons just on the base. I'm well over the budget that I'm allowed to have. So we need to look to optimize. It's easy to work with loops because it's we can edit our mesh quickly. We can get that symmetry that we want. There's a level of precision that we gain when working with loops. It certainly makes UV mapping a whole lot easier, but at the end of the day, we need to optimize our mesh to get it to work within our polygonal budget, okay? So this is a technique that's tried and true. You can do, I encourage you to do this as much as you can, and that's to start breaking apart your mesh into its component pieces. So for example, I could just very quickly go in, select maybe just the elements of the dumpster, these arms, for example, and this is going to be kind of sloppy because I want to try to do it quickly here. But I'm just going to select all these. Yes, you got to be careful. You got to be careful. Okay, it's Modo has a really great selection system, but unfortunately, we have to watch what we're doing. It's one of those things where it's like only you can prevent forest fires. I saw a really great little image on Facebook the other day. It was Smokey the Bear. And it said, only you can prevent forest fires, ... and you have to because the government shut down. I thought it was kind of a funny joke. Anyone? Bueller? You got it? Okay. Hopefully no one in here is being adversely affected by the government shutdown. Saw on the news earlier today that some dude, and it's literally just some dude, is mowing the lawn out in front of the Lincoln Memorial because the government shut down. He's just by himself. He's like, I'm just going to go mow the lawn because I don't want the lawn to be long in front of the Lincoln Memorial. Anyways, so I thought that was kind of funny. All right, so there's my selection. Now this is a perfect example of a part of the mesh that I can optimize. So here's kind of a great idea and a great technique. I'm going to rip apart my model. I'm going to disconnect these polygons and unweld them, if you will, from the base of my dumpster. Now there's a really easy, quick way of doing this without having to create a new mesh item. Just do a cut operation. So Command X. So I'm going to go to the top of the screen where it says Edit. And I'm just going to choose Cut. Now, all of those polygons were saved to my clipboard, rock and roll, and I don't think I had all of them. Hold on a sec. Yep, I missed a couple. Yep, there's the other culprit. Okay, so I'm going to do Command X to cut, and then I'm just going to do Edit, Paste. So I'm basically cutting the polygons back into their original location. And what we've created here is a discontiguous piece. It's all separate now. You only really want to do this at the end of your entire process, because what we yield in this is a piece that's now separate, and there's loops in here that I can go in and remove that I don't necessarily need anymore, like that loop. Not doing a single thing, so we can get rid of it. Okay? Like this loop in here. Let's see, is that really needed? Yeah, it's probably needed, but we can get rid of it if we wanted to. Really, where we gain a lot of polygons is on the base of our, is on the base. Because look at all of these loops now, we get to kind of nuke. All of these in here get to go, all of those. I mean, there's a lot of loops in here now that we can remove that were only there and really being used when that side arm piece was being stuck on to the body of my geometry. Okay. I'm also going to do this. So I'm going to throw a little snapping on for a second. And I'm just going to draw a center line. Or I was trying to draw a center line. Why didn't that work? There we go. I'm just going to set these vertices 0 along the x. There we go. All right, because check it out. This is great. Because now I could very quickly, I have half my model in here now. Because now I can go in and I can start nuking some of these edges that really aren't doing much. Okay, you'll have to make some decisions as to which ones you want to keep and which ones you can get rid of. But there's a lot of room in here to optimize. In every sense, you could go in and, like for example, I'm just going to fill these holes here with a polygon. Polygon. 1, 2, 3, 4, polygon. 1, 2, 3, 4, polygon. Okay, there we go. I'll do the same for the bottom. Oops. Cool. All right. And now I can get rid of some of these. Yeah, just backspace, backspace. I mean, I am saving polygons like crazy just in this one section. At the end of the day, the result will be identical. It will be precisely the same as what we had before. It will be a fraction of the polygonal weight. And this is good 3D modeling, especially for games. We want to make sure that we have the resolution where we need it, but we also don't want to go spend the entirety of our budget on something we're never going to see. There we go. So that's a huge reduction in polygonal weight just by separating that one piece out from the remainder of the body. Okay? And then deleting all of the edge loops that were no longer necessary. If I unhide the rest of my mesh, you can see what I have. I still have a piece here that's pretty good weight. Then I have another piece here. You know, just in the total of that, The body is now going to be about 150 polygons. It was 536 before, so we have drastically reduced the weight of our body just by separating the arms out from the rest of the mesh. Okay? I love it. It doesn't all have to be connected in the end. In the end, it doesn't all have to be connected. It's not a bad idea to have everything be a connected piece while you're modeling, but when you're ready to UV and when you're ready to texture, down-res it. Down-res it. Works pretty well. Pretty well. Okay? All right, so one other kind of modeling thing that Austin had, he had a number of things that were already UV'd, and these elements inside of my UV map, let's see, it should already be UV'd. Yep, so I have almost everything here UV'd, rock and roll, and let's just focus on the arms. Austin he already had his elements UV'd for his arms, or it was the lids, right, Austin? The lids, yeah, and he was mirroring this content across the axis, which is fantastic. Great solution for the issue. He made the UVs for one, and when he duplicated it, the UVs were already generated. So let me show you what I'm talking about. I got my little arms here, and if I go into my duplication tools, so duplicate, let's just fire off mirror, action center set to origin. I'll click on the left side of the x-axis. There we go. Now I have duplicate UVs chilling down over there. And this is what we get. Okay? I'm just going to throw all the UVs for this element into a new material called test. And I'm going to apply the material, the UV checker material preset to that group. Let's just make sure it's going into the right texture locator. All right. Okay. So this is the issue that we have at hand. If you look at the material over here, everything's looking fine and dandy, right? Looking good. We can read all the letters legibly. Okay. There's a little bit of distortion in there, but for the most part, I'm happy with it. It's nothing to write home about, nothing too crazy, okay? And most importantly, if you look carefully at the way the letters are being written, this is, we can read, all the letters are in their correct orientation, right? However, if we go to the other side of the mesh, on the element that we just duplicated, what happened to all the letters? They're flipped, they're backwards, okay? And that's because if you look carefully at your UV islands, they're perfectly oriented to each other. Okay, they weren't mirrored when we duplicated the geometry. Only the polygons were mirrored. The UVs retained their original orientation and location within the UV map. Now we can change this. We can change this if we'd like. Okay. In some cases, if you don't have text on the actual element itself, you can get away with murder. Okay, it doesn't really matter. If it's just like scratches and bumps and stuff, you'll never see the difference in the actual texture map. But if there's going to be a decal there, or something that is very noticeable that you want that the gamer is going to see, then you may want to make some additions to how your UVs are generated. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to select my UVs. Excuse me. And one of the commands that we have access to over in our UV tools is there's actually a mirror. There it is, mirror UVs right there. Okay. So if we mirror our UVs, you'll get this little popover somewhere in your screen. Where's mine? Did it already mirror it? Oh, you know what? I'm thinking of, there it is, mirror UV. So you get to choose the axis that you want to mirror these along. Okay. Let's just do 5, or on the U. There we go. Ta-da. And it worked, okay? So what we could do after the fact is move them into position, and things are good. Things are good. And this is kind of what you want to have for something like that. So you can mirror the UVs and flip them across the axis. Yeah?
I was going to say, if it's just a text thing, you do a flip on that one side.
You can give it a try. Give it a try, see if it works. Absolutely. Absolutely. So what Austin is saying here, instead of doing mirror UVs, there's another command in here called flip, okay, which is right kind of almost right above mirror UVs. So here's mirror, here's flip, right underneath orient pieces. Okay. And looks like flip did it horizontally. If we keep going here, yeah, it's just going to do it vertically. So some issues there. I find that mirror UVs is probably the result that we're going to want to try to capture for something particular like this. But give it a try. You never know what's going to happen. There we go. Okay, mirror UVs. Really good feature to use, for sure. Okay. Other questions that you guys had when modeling all of this? Issues that you ran into? Okay. All right. All right, let's jump over to renderography real fast. I just want to kind of revisit real quickly what the expectations are for this week. So I've gone ahead and I posted all the week 7 content inside the GCOM 424 page. This week is all about painting in Photoshop. So if we open up that web page and take a look at precisely what we're going to be exploring, there's some really neat things that I'm going to be asking you guys to create for this week's homework assignment. Specifically, we're going to focus almost entirely on the painting of metallic textures inside of Photoshop. This week's going to be metallic textures. Next week, we're going to start looking at some other ways, some other materials that we can craft and create. Specifically, we're going to be talking about wood textures here momentarily. And each one of these kind of artistic techniques and styles brings its own tool set to the surface. Okay? So this week is all about metals, and it's going to be a fun conversation. Through our conversation this week, the output is going to be a final painted diffuse texture map for your dumpster. Okay, so more on this later. So we've been modeling the dumpster all week. Now it's time to paint this bad boy and get them up and running. Our lab this week is going to be really easy. We're going to be doing some texture resource collection. More on that later, but so it's going to be pretty fun. I've also given you guys some resources that I would like you to bookmark, including some really great texture maps that you're more than welcome to use going forward as soon as the web page loads. So some really great texture maps that I would encourage you to use. I've also given you access to some really great brushes that I think will be important and apt going forward. In addition, there's also, I think, 7 or 8 videos that completely encapsulate everything that we're going to talk about today. So I've hit you guys up with a lot of resources that cover a lot of basic areas. So if you have any questions on these, definitely reference the website for all this stuff. There's some goodies in here for sure. Okay? All right. For whatever reason, the website's just taking forever. I apologize. There we go. Now it's loading. So here's all the freebies. There's some texture maps. There's also some brushes in here that I found online that I think are quite good. And then here are all those videos that talk about or that address everything that we're going to talk about today. All right. Questions, questions, questions. All right. I'm going to revert my project file back. I want to get us back to its original form because I want to spend some time talking about some of the important elements that we need to generate and some strategies that you need to look at before we start baking out a whole series of images for this object. Over the past couple of weeks, we looked at the baking process inside of Modo. We're going to continue to work with these today. We're going to absolutely continue to bake out our ambient occlusion pass, our surface ID, and our alpha outputs. With our dumpster, excuse me, with our crate, working with these basic baked images was pretty easy, and a lot of you probably started to see the benefit, but I think you'll absolutely understand why we're choosing to do what we do with these baked images on a complex system like we have here on the dumpster. Our crate, for example, only really had 6 general UV islands that we had to work with. Well, here on our dumpster, you probably created a series of UVs that were definitely a little bit more intricate than those 6 basic cubes for the sides of our crate. This is the result that I came up with. Yours is going to be a little bit different depending on how you chose to model and UV everything. But as you can see here on mine, there's a lot going on. Okay? There's a lot going on. So we can no longer rely upon our selection technique with our pen and our mouse over in Photoshop to give us the accuracy that we need when defining all of these textures in Photoshop. Okay? We have to start utilizing the power of that Surface ID baked texture map to give us the result that we want. Okay, that's the only way for us to get the pixel accuracy that we want to generate super detailed, super precise textures over in Photoshop. Often the layout of all of our UV maps, excuse me, the layout of our UV islands are going to be pretty dense. Okay, for a prop piece like this, we're going to throw everything on one texture map. If you're working on a character or a larger set piece, your model may be broken out into multiple textures. I think I've shown you guys my Jeep, right? It's got like almost 30 different textures on it. There's a lot of texture work going on in that file because I wanted to make it just incredibly high resolution and just incredibly detailed. Well, this is going to be very low resolution, but we still want to capture a lot of detail in the texture map. So we're going to have one texture file for this dumpster. So all of our UV islands need to be packed strategically in the upper positive UV quadrant of our UV editor. So it's going to be a little bit of a challenge to work with these UVs over in Photoshop. 10 times more challenging if we don't have that Surface ID render output at our disposal. Okay? So let's talk about how we can kind of revisit that entire baking system to get the results that we want. Okay, so walk me through the process of baking a texture map out of Modo and into a format that Photoshop can read and understand. Yeah, absolutely, and I like the way Dylan's approaching this. Different bits and different materials, absolutely. So I've already gone through and I've assigned all of these major UV islands into their own material group. And you can see those material groups over here in my shader tree. Do the names of these material groups really matter? Not really. They're really for you, as Dylan said. I think that's a really good point. They're really for you. I've kind of gone ahead and intelligently named all of my groups just so I kind of have an idea of their role within the shader tree. But ultimately, these could be numbers. These can be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It doesn't matter. Each material group is going to get a unique color automatically assigned to it from the Surface ID render output. I've already gone ahead and added the Surface ID render output into my shader tree. So if we jump over into the render tab, or just open up a preview window, hit F8, open up a unique preview window. This is kind of a cool little trick. Inside of every preview window that you make inside of Modo, you can go over here to the, not options, but this effect, the center kind of button here, and we can individually preview which surface or which pass that we want to look at, which render output. And here's the results. This is exactly what we want. You can already see the magic of the Surface ID pass. It's assigning all the polygons inside of those material groups its own magical color. Now, I'm not determining which color is being used here. Modo is doing that for us, okay? All right, so things are looking pretty good, pretty delicioso. Groovy. Okay. So I'm happy with that. How do I bake out my Surface ID pass into a 2D texture map that I can use over in Photoshop? What's the sequence? Select the item. I like it. Dumpster, selected. Make sure the UV map is selected. Perfect. Let's go to the shader tree. Now I want to make sure that Surface ID is visible. FYI, you can also do all three of them at the exact same time. I like doing them individually so I can focus the computer on the results that I'm wanting. Okay, and then where do I go? Not quite yet. There's one final thing that we need to change, right? What is it? What determines the size of this texture map that's baked out? Not here in Modo. Remember, we're asking Modo to create a JPEG, or in our case, a PNG file. What determines the size of that PNG file? Yeah. A little bit different process than when we're exporting our UVs, right? Now we're physically baking something. We're physically creating a 2D texture map. What determines the size of that texture map? You got it. So if I go into the shader tree, Carlos had it right. If I go into properties now, it's the frame tab. It's the frame tab, okay? Specifically the frame width and height down here. So let's just put this to 1024 by 1024, rock and roll. And I need to restore my layout here real fast. (1024 by 1024), and let me just confirm that all of those elements are selected. The dumpster is selected, the UV map is selected. Now I can go render, bake to render outputs. Okay, and we're off to the races. The surface ID should take but a moment to render. It's a very fast render, as it's just taking all of that general color information and baking it onto the UV islands. This is a utility map, so this is something that we're only truly going to use to help us make selections and make layer masks over in Photoshop. That's it. So we're never really going to use this for anything other than helping us generate pixel perfect selections. Okay, so that one's done. Let's go back in and do our ambient occlusion. So I've already added this render output into the mix. Let's render this one out. Same process, bake to render outputs. Now this one we have to be a little bit more careful about, and I want to show you why here in a minute. As you can see, the results are pretty compelling. We're getting this lovely soft shadow look around all the areas that are next to parts and pieces within our scene. Just kind of cruising through, looking good. This is one of those passes that I absolutely love to infuse on all of the elements that I craft inside of Modo. It really does make a big difference. It adds a nice healthy sense of realism on every single thing that we do. Okay, now let's take a look at what we've created here. Just going to zoom in on the render to a value of 100%. Now, if we compare what was rendered up at the top here, this is looking amazing. I mean, look at all the detail that we preserved on the brackets for the wheels, on the front. I mean, now we can actually start to see details of the dumpster come to life just in this ambient occlusion. You know, we can start to see maybe where we're naturally going to want to place some grime and some other elements along the sides of our dumpster. However, we run into a small little bit of an issue down here in this portion of my UV map, or excuse me, in this portion of my ambient occlusion baked image, okay? These three UV islands represent the lids of my dumpster, okay? Check it out. Specifically what I'm talking about are these three guys. See, these are the lids in here, right? Pretty cool. And if you look carefully, these are the tops. So we see the tops here. And then, of course, I also have the bottoms, which are underneath the dumpster. Okay? We can see their UV islands down here, and it kind of makes sense. So that works here. However, what about all this big blackness? Blackness? Is that even a word? The big darkness that we have in our map over here. It's the inside of the dumpster. Okay? Carlos absolutely had it right. These polygons here define the inside portion of the dumpster. Right now, the lid is on top of my dumpster, right? So those ambient occlusion rays aren't even entering into the dumpster, and what the computer is calculating is just pure blackness, okay? So the ambient occlusion rays, which are truly fired off by the global illumination system within the computer, are only going to interact with the objects on the outside of our dumpster. If the rays can't make it through a piece of geometry, we're not going to get any lovely ambient occlusion information for the insides, okay? So what are we to do? Well, we have some options here. Let me show you what I'm talking about. We're going to rebake this image here momentarily to kind of resolve that, because I want some AO information on the inside of the dumpster as well. Check it out. Maybe I just move these guys out of the way. Or if I put them way out here in the front, so they're not obstructing the inside of the dumpster. My AO rays are still going to hit where they need to hit, so they're going to, boom, hit those guys here. We're going to get a nice bounce, for the underside of the dumpster, and the rays are also going to go into the dumpster and bounce around in here and collect some lovely shadow information for the interior. Okay, let's do it now. Let's do it again. I'm going to bake out dumpster, ready to render. And now let's see what we yield. Slowly but surely, it walks around. Excuse me. There we go. And we can already see in the dumpster, underneath the dumpster, it's not in pure darkness anymore. Okay, we're getting a little bit of a bounce there, which is what we want, which is pretty cool. And now, once we reach the inside of the dumpster, yeah, we're getting a much more realistic AO bounce for the interior of our dumpster as well. So small little details that you might want to start to think about as we work through this baking process. How the objects are oriented within our scene are absolutely going to influence the quality of these baked images. Yeah, go ahead.
So if you were to separate every single piece out, would it come out perfect?
Well, the answer is yes. It would come out. You have to look at where you want to get shadow information and where you don't want to get shadow information. Okay. For example, I don't want to move certain pieces away from each other because then I wouldn't get, shadow information up in here. Okay. Now I really want shadows in this part of my mesh. If I took those little arms and moved them away from the dumpsters, I wouldn't get those little bounces next to the walls, the exterior wall of my dumpster. Okay. So we just have to kind of think through it. Okay. These are occlusion rays. Okay. So they're kind of determining where things are placed next to each other. So think through it. Just intelligently determine where you want shadows to interact with each other on the model and where you don't. All right. And last but certainly not least, we absolutely want to make sure that we have an alpha output. This is a quick one. Boom. Should take about a heartbeat to bake it all out. There it is. All right. So those are the 3 utility maps that we're going to need to generate before we're able to start working inside of Photoshop. And as always, how do we export our UVs? So texture, export UVs to EPS. So really at the end of the day, there's 4 elements that you're going to be exporting from Modo and into Photoshop. Our UVs, the alpha output, surface ID output, and the ambient occlusion output. Those four utility items from Modo are just going to really help us make super accurate and quickly produced texture files in Photoshop. All right, now I've gone ahead and I've already done this. Let's go ahead and start a new Photoshop document. I want to show you some setup stuff that is important. We're going to be creating kind of like a coloring book for our UVs, for our dumpster, using these UVs over in Photoshop. However, before we start really digging in and establishing some complex textures inside of Photoshop, we need to test a couple things first, okay? Because you're going to be investing a tremendous amount of time in Photoshop to gain the results that you want. It's probably a good idea to ensure that the foundation of your texture is where you need it to be before you go any further. I want to open up my UVs here. Go. Let's open this bad boy up. Here's the EPS file that was generated from Modo. And I'm going to rasterize it to a 1024, or actually I think everything that I baked was 2048. So I'll just do 2048 by 2048. The mode set to RGB. Hit OK, and we're on our way. All right. Yeah. You don't necessarily have to. I think doing everything 1024 by 1024 is a great way to work. I did 2048 by 2048 just to make it a little bit easier for you guys to see on the screen here the detail work that I'm infusing onto the model. I've also already baked out all of my source images at 2048 by 2048. So this also saves me a step from having to scale down all those baked images from Modo to the 1K texture size. I think it's not a bad habit, though. It's not a bad technique and idea to paint a little bit larger than the final resolution and then downscale. Gives you some options, but also it could produce some problems on the detail size. If you have really fine details, those might get lost when you downscale the image. All right, I want to add just a very, very small stroke to this. Make it really bright. I always pick bright purple as the color for my strokes. I very rarely find myself painting with bright purple, so it's a nice color to use for my brain. I never pick black. Oops, wrong value. Sorry, I want to make that a 2-pixel stroke. I almost never use black, as there's a lot of black in all of our textures that we create. All right. So immediately I'm going to save this as a different file. I don't want to keep it dumpsters uv.eps. So this will be dumpster text tex, and then I'm going to go underscore diff for diffuse. And I'm just going to save it on my desktop for the time being, just so I don't overwrite the file that's already been created for this project. Now I'm going to go in. I'm going to open up all those other source images that I created for my project. Let me just navigate to the folder that contains all of this stuff. As you can see, I get pretty crazy. All right, here's the Surface ID. Here's everything all combined in one. Awesome. So I'm just going to hold down the Shift key and drag each one of these layers from that source file into the other. Rock and roll. There we go. Now everything's combined into one, and I'm a happy camper. All right, I mentioned before that you want to check all of your work quickly. Okay, you want to get to that end result, or you want to be able to see if the foundation of your project file is working before you go in and really start investing a lot of time hand painting these textures. And this is something that a lot of people overlook and they step past because they assume that Modo or any application has correctly baked all these images out initially. Okay, I don't like to make assumptions. I know that I'm going to probably invest all day in painting this texture map. So it's a good idea for me to test the system before I go any further. Okay? So let me show you my process of setting up my texture file and testing this entire round trip loop before I start bringing in metal textures and before I start painting high detail inside of my Photoshop document. Okay? The first thing that I do is that I set up a whole series, and I mean a whole series of texture masks, or excuse me, layer masks and groups. Each group is going to match the color that I've created in my Surface ID. So I'm just go in and do this pretty quickly here. Down in the bottom portion of my layers palette, we have the ability to make a group, this little folder icon. Now I like working in groups, okay? Because that way I can mask the group using the pixel colors and the outlines of my UV maps. And then, because the group is masked, the folder is masked, anything that I put inside that folder is automatically going to get masked, right? So really, I'm only establishing the layer mask once per UV group, okay? Makes the process of texturing go a lot faster, So I'm just going to create a couple groups here. So I just created 4 groups, and I'm just going to leave them named as such. And now, with my Surface ID pass on, I can go grab Magic Wand. Go, and I'm just going to do a little shift click here. I'm trying to find all the colors that the computer assigned this kind of lovely pinkish purple to. And then I'm going to apply that selection as a layer mask to group number 1. And this is the button within inside of our layers palette which will allow us to do that. Boom. And you can already see inside of my layers palette here what's happened. Here's the folder. It now has a layer mask based on the selection that I had already established with the Magic Wand tool. Okay, so now let's keep going. I'm going to grab maybe these purple ones. I'm just starting at the top, going to work my way down towards the bottom. Assign it as a layer mask. Okay, so that one's done. Here's the plate. Group 3. That one's done. Group 4 will be this purple bar. Layer mask. Group 5 will be this. This is either a rivet or a screw of some kind. Create a couple more folders so we can keep going. Grab all of these guys. These are all parts for the wheels. assign the layer mask. And this is just the first thing that I do. Because I know from experience that if I don't have a good foundation initially, I'm kind of building my house on sand, okay? And let me show you precisely what I'm talking about here, okay? I'm going to collapse all of these folders. There we go. And let's just place my ambient occlusion map on the very tippy top. Oops, I accidentally placed it inside of group 7. Didn't want that to happen. There we go. Oh, looks like I didn't get group 8. Sorry, group 8, didn't mean to forget you. You can see it just takes about 30 seconds to do all this. Okay, we don't want to commit a tremendous amount of time. What blend mode am I going to assign my my ambient occlusion map to? Multiply. That way I get rid of all the white and I keep all of the lovely shadow information on the actual map itself. Okay. All right, so there's the ambient occlusion map. I want to punch out all the black background on my ambient occlusion map. How do I do that? What's a fast, easy, quick way of doing it? How do I add a layer mask to my ambient occlusion map that precisely matches all of the UV groups and the UV islands in my Photoshop texture? Yeah, Seth, go ahead.
Selections on your surface ID map.
Yeah. Yeah, so I like the way that Seth is approaching this. We can absolutely continue to use the magic wand tool to make selections generated from our Surface ID pass. That's fine. However, don't forget that we also have this lovely alpha output, which already has a black and white outline of all of our UVs. Now let me show you how we're going to want to use this, okay? Because this is pretty neat. I dig it in many ways, okay? With my alpha output active, check it out. I can go over to my Channels tab, and the Channels tab will allow me to very quickly make a selection that's generated from the black and white tonal value of the pixels on the screen. We can do that just by holding down the Command key and clicking on any one of these 3 channels. And it may be hard to see, so I'm going to zoom in so you guys can check it out. See, when I hold down the Command key on my keyboard, my mouse changes to that hand cursor with the little marching ants dashed rectangle around it. That's saying that if I was to click, I would generate a selection. Check it out. Simply going to Command click on the channel, boom, and it automatically makes a selection of just the white pixels on that layer. Okay? Really fast way to make a global selection, and truly the only and the best application of using the alpha output. Now that I have that selection, I can very quickly go back to my my ambient occlusion pass inside my Photoshop texture and just apply it as a layer mask. And you see that within 2 clicks, I've punched out the black background for my ambient occlusion, and I can continue working quickly. Yes, sir. Yeah, so what you want to do is that you want to solo your alpha output. So just make sure that's the only layer that's on. Okay, that's the only layer that's on at the moment. And then I went back to my Channels tab, which is right next to my Layers tab. And then simply hold down your Command key and click on either the red, green, or blue channel thumbnail inside the Channels tab. And it will make a selection based on that, on the black and white pixel values in this area. Okay? So all we're doing here is we're just trying to generate a selection. That's it. That's it. And then from that selection, we can go back to our ambient occlusion and apply that selection as a layer mask. Because we absolutely want to punch out the black background on our ambient occlusion pass so we can begin working. Okay, so there's a couple things in here that we're looking for. Excuse me, hit the wrong button. A couple things that we're looking for in the final texture. At times, what generates inside the ambient occlusion pass are little black outlines around all of our UVs, and I want to make sure that those black outlines aren't showing up on the model over in Modo. Okay, because I would hate for us to do all this work setting up these textures and painting, only to have everything encapsulated by these small little black outlines. And specifically what I'm talking about, it's maybe a little bit difficult to see, excuse me, but there are little black outlines in here that's cruising around. There's kind of one running down here. They're basically going to run around the borders of all of our UVs. Say again? And this is what we need to test. This is what we need to test, okay? If they're showing up super thick, we need to ensure that we don't necessarily see those on the model over in Modo, okay? This is the foundation that I'm talking about. Now remember, we're painting in a coloring book here. Whatever's outside the lines of our UVs aren't going to be seen. So if they're outside the lines of our UV map, then life is good. We can move on. But I need to be sure. I need to be sure that I don't see those black lines outside my UVs. So the only way for us to double check, the only way for us to triple check is to get the model back in Modo and see if it works. Okay? So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to create a new solid color. And I'm going to make it I'll just make it dark red. And I'll put that dark red solid color layer below my ambient occlusion map. So now it's really easy to see all of those black outlines, right? Can you guys see those on my screen? Those black outlines around all of our UV islands? Yeah, okay. So with this done, let's go back over, and I'm just going to export this. Save as. I'm going to save it as a PNG. And let's just call it V01. Save it on my desktop. And I'm going to import that file and apply it to my dumpster over here in Modo. Okay, let's see how things are working. Add layer, image map, load image. Mine's chilling on my desktop. There it is. Well, that's my UVs, excuse me. I want the PNG. Oh, I made a mistake. Where did I save my texture? I don't even know. Oh my gosh. My file is currently being saved in the background. This is something that's new in Photoshop. It does all this background processing now in Photoshop 6 and in CC. Sometimes it just gets in the way. No, it is on there. Why didn't I see that? Oh, there it is. All right. All right, so here's my texture map. So I just need to see here. Yeah, and it is. Check it out. Can you guys see that line? I'm also going to do this. Sometimes it's really difficult to see and gauge how your ambient occlusion texture map is influencing your mesh with the wireframes on. Let me show you a cool little trick on how to resolve this inside the OpenGL viewport. In Modo 701, if you put your cursor inside the OpenGL viewport, hit the O key. O is in October. We'll bring open your viewport properties, and then under the active mesh option, what you want to do is change your wireframe overlay from colored to none. And now all of your wireframes are going to be gone. Aha. Yeah. There is a shadow here, especially on this back edge, that should not be there. Okay, it's running along right in here. Okay. Let's see if we can see it in other places on the screen. I think with just a solid color, you can kind of gauge the importance of this ambient occlusion map. It's already looking pretty awesome. Yeah. So sometimes we get black outlines, sometimes we don't get any outline at all, which is a little bit of an issue for us. Okay? We have a problem. We need to fix this problem before we go any further. Okay? Because if we don't fix this problem now, any details that we paint inside of this area aren't going to show up. There's going to be an opening inside of the texture. Okay? And this is truly the issue that we run into when we're working with seams in our UVs. Okay? So we can't have this. I'm so happy that I zeroed in on this problem now instead of 8 hours from now at the end of my texturing stage, because it's very, very easy for me to fix this problem now opposed to later. Okay, let me show you the resolution for this problem and truly why Moto is generating this result. I don't want to see a gap here or a black line in other parts of my mesh. Okay, this issue is entirely being generated by something called UV bake border. Okay, the UV bake border size is a technical specification on the back end of the Moto rendering system that determines the size of our UV maps, or excuse me, the size of our UV islands when they're baked. Okay, and let me show you what specifically is happening on the back end, and I can show you how we can resolve this issue to gain the result that we want. Okay, this is an important technical thing that a lot of people, they just skip over. Okay, because they just want to get into texturing, right? This is, for me, this is one of those things that you just have to stop, resolve before you go any further, then you can start painting instead of Photoshop. Okay, check it out. All right. I want you to notice something here when I bake out my alpha output. I want to bake my alpha output out one more time. I want you to watch very closely to my computer. I want to zoom in. You guys might be able to see it a little bit easier if I zoom in. Render, bake to render outputs. Okay, it's going, it's going. Okay, look at the size of my UVs. Look at the outlines. Look right here. Look right here. Look right here. Boom. What happened? What happened? Did you guys see it? They grew. They got bigger, right? The moment it stopped rendering, everything went, it popped out a couple pixels. That's the UV bake border size in effect, okay? And really what's going on in here is that the computer is extending the size of all of these baked pixels by a couple pixels, okay? And there's some reasons why we want to do this from time to time. Hopefully it'll avoid, excuse me, hopefully it's designed to avoid ripping seams apart, but the one thing that isn't calculated in this process is ambient occlusion, okay? The ambient occlusion of baked render output doesn't get this lovely benefit of having everything pop out by a couple pixels, okay? Let's see it in action on the Surface ID. So we turn off alpha output, turn on Surface ID, bake to render outputs. Oops, Surface ID got it by 1 pixel, okay? Ambient occlusion isn't going to get it at all, okay? So in essence, what we have here is that we have an alpha output that does not match all of our others, okay? The alpha output is always going to be a couple pixels bigger than all of the other baked render outputs, okay? So when we mask things off using the alpha output, there's going to be holes, okay? We can't have that. We can't have holes inside of our texture map. So let me show you the preference that will allow us to go in and remove this function from happening inside the computer, okay? You can find it on your Moto preferences. So Moto preferences, and it should be in, let's see. Oh my gosh, I've now had a brain fart. Images and painting? No. Render? Rendering? Final rendering, here it is. Okay. Under final rendering, and here it is, UV bake UV border size. And right now the default value is set to 1. Okay? If we were to increase this to like 7, let's just, not Y, 7, let's see what happens, okay? Just so we have a point of comparison. This next one, we're going to bake out our alpha output once more. Okay, watch the image. It'll go pretty quickly here. Whoop, now pushed it out, 7 pixels, okay? Well, we don't want this to happen, so we got to turn this value down to 0. All right. All right, let's put it down to 0. Let's render it out again. Now watch. When it's done, doesn't move. Now our alpha output precisely matches the entirety of our UV islands, okay? This is going to give us a more accurate mask, and really we only want to use this on the layer mask that we're using for our ambient occlusion, okay? Right. You got it. Bake UV border size, okay? The default value should be 1, but whenever we're baking our ambient occlusion maps, let's put it down to 0. Or we may have to experiment with this depending on the size of the image that we're crafting, okay? So I have mine set at 0. Let me just save this one out real fast, save image, and I'm just going to say alpha ID or alpha bake border 0. I'll put it on my desktop. Now let's jump back over into Photoshop and get that guy in here. All right, so I'm going to solo that layer. Oops, you know what? I rendered it the wrong size. Let me render that again. Here we go. All right. I'll import that file back into Modo at the correct size. Get it hooked into my texture network here. Let's see what we can see. So there it is. So I want to use this image once again as the driver for the selection that I need to make the layer mask on my alpha output or my ambient occlusion output. So select it, and I'm just going to do this. I'm going to get rid of the old layer mask. Don't want that anymore. Delete it. And then with that new selection, here we go. With that new selection on my ambient occlusion mask, just going to load it in. Okay, let's see what we can see here. The bake border size of 0, are we going to get the same result? Okay. Let's save out our texture. I'm going to overwrite the texture file that's already out there. That way I don't have to re-import it back into Modo. That's kind of the great thing about working inside of this system. This round tripping can be made very easy. Yeah. It's off to the what? It's off to the side a little bit. Make sure you're holding down the Shift key when you're dragging from document to document. That way it'll constrain it perfectly in the center of the new one. Okay, so we still have some issues. We're still getting that hole here. So now we need to start exploring why we're generating that hole. Maybe we need to increase our UV bake border size to a value of 2. Okay, and this is where the experimentation process really needs to begin with texturing. Okay, because I need to ensure that I'm not getting any sort of opening in here for my ambient occlusion. Okay, let's go back over into Photoshop and continue to explore this. Let me show you a really great trick, and we're still getting black outlines around certain areas. Okay, and then down here, yeah, and down here we're getting some openings as well. So perhaps I went the wrong direction. Perhaps I need to go, instead of going down to 0, maybe I need to increase my UV bake border size to a higher value, something other than 0. So we have to be little mini detectives here to figure out what the result needs to be. But we're zeroing in on the feature that's allowing us to drive this preference. So I'm going to put my UV beak border size to 2. Bake it out one more time. And we're on our way. This time, let's say the UV bake border size is 2. Let's go back over to Photoshop, load that new file in. This time, I want to use this as my selection. Follow the same procedure that I did before. I'm going to nuke my ambient occlusion layer mask just by deleting it. And then I'll use that new selection, which I generated from that new alpha output. See what we get. Yeah, kind of zeroing in, but I'm still getting that outline that I don't want right in here. So I want to take this, I want to take matters into my own hand. Instead of rebaking things over and over and over and over and over again inside of Photoshop, or inside of Modo, here's an alternative. Really what I want to do is I need to contract this selection a little bit. I need to make it like maybe 1 pixel smaller. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to use that image that I just created as the impetus of my selection. Delete the layer mask. Okay, rock and roll. But this time, I'm going to go to Select, Modify, and I'm going to contract it by 1 pixel. Boom. See how I made the entire selection smaller by 1 pixel? This is kind of closer to what I want to have. Okay. Sometimes contracting your selection inside of Photoshop can give you some funky results, which is why I generally try to avoid it as much as I can. But from time to time, it'll just save you some time. There we go. Now we're getting there. Slowly but surely, we're getting there. This is what we're testing. This is what we're testing to make sure that it's not off, that it's off, that it's not off. Let's contract it. Instead of 1 pixel, let's do 2 pixels. There we go. And we can use that selection as our mask. And now let's see what we got, because now I don't have any black lines in there. Yeah. Let's see if that made an impact. Save as, PNG. Let's go back over to Modo. Oh, now I got humongous white lines, so I've gone the opposite way that I should have gone. It's a cool look, but I've made it worse than it actually needs, so I need to go the opposite direction. Yeah. Kind of like cell shading, right. So let me just take a step back in time here. Boop, 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 boop. So welcome to texturing. You fix one thing and you solve another. All right. And, you know, the reality of the situation is sometimes you'll just have to hand paint them out. I know I can't have, right now in the current form of this, I'm trying to resolve there we go. Trying to resolve those gaps down in there. Okay, so I need to expand my selection here. I need to expand this by 1 pixel. Yeah, it's a give and take. Yeah, and we're going to have to go in and hand paint some of this stuff out. Okay. But it's really easy to see these now, these little errors in the texture map now, opposed to later. There we go. Yeah, now we're getting kind of what I want. And then we'll just let the hand go in by hand and maybe remove some of these black lines in the AO map. Yeah.
Separate the two sections, like where it is you're getting white lines and where it is you're getting black lines, and separate those two into two groups in Photoshop file.
You could? Yeah.
Increase one, increase the other.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. There are a dozen ways to skin this cat, for sure. I'm all about, oops, wrong keyboard shortcut. I'm all about making it easier for my brain to decode what's going on. So sometimes, for me, it's just easier to go in. Sometimes for me, it's just easier to go in and just select large swaths of things. I was like, I know I don't want ambient occlusion over here, dude. So I'm going to go in and just nuke these. Now, is there a way, let's see, maybe we can use some of these Surface ID passes to expedite this selection? Yeah. The Surface ID passes, yeah, the Surface ID passes aren't going to help us out in this regard too much. So we'll have to go in and very quickly paint some of this out by hand. However, you know, one of the things we could do, this is kind of a cool idea. Oops. Check this out. And go to my selection tool, and let's do this. I'm going to hold down the Command and Shift key, and I want to select all of these layer masks. There we go. And what I've created is a selection of all these top elements, okay? And now one of the things that you could do is that you could just inverse your selection, basically flip it, and then hit the delete key. Make sure I'm on the AO pass. Oops. Of course, I nuked all the ones at the bottom, but yeah, we're still getting those outlines. That's because, in effect, I'm doing exactly what the mask should be doing. So, yeah, I mean, there's no reason you couldn't. There's no reason you couldn't. Like I said, there's a bazillion ways to do the exact same thing. I'm trying to do it in a fashion that doesn't require me to that gives me a little bit of accuracy. That's all. Okay. So I need to go in and get rid of all these black outlines around some of my AO levels here. I could bake out another one with a larger UV bake border size that would extend past these borders and give me the option to do this very quickly. I like that idea. That's not a bad idea in itself. Yeah, that's not horrible. But these are the types of details that we just really need to focus on and look at as we're in the early stages of the texturing of our dumpster. We have to wrangle our ambient occlusion map. Sometimes it'll give us some funky outcomes. Sometimes that UV baked border size will come back and haunt us. We just have to stay on top of it. Okay? We have to look carefully at what the model is producing and what the maps from Modo are producing and ensure that everything matches what we desire to be our final result. Okay? Questions? Were you shaking your head no, Austin, or is that yes? Okay, good. Couldn't see it from here. All right, let's take a break for a couple minutes, okay? Alrighty, Ray. So I wanted to spend some time, pretty much the remainder of our class time today, talking about how we can use these Photoshop textures to really create a compelling illusion for metal. All right. So we've been testing our entire texture setup, if you will, inside of Photoshop, and we have some bugs that we still need to resolve. There's some issues with our ambient occlusion map that's producing some black outlines, but all of these things we can very quickly resolve, okay, without too much huss and fuss going forward in the future, okay. If for another 10 minutes of work, I can fix all my ambient occlusion map stuff just by painting out parts of the ambient occlusion map that I don't want and then moving on. Okay, I can do that real quickly. I'm not going to force you guys to watch me do this monotony of painting here in Photoshop, but it's really easy for us to quickly establish that resolution without too much issue. Okay. However, what I do want to spend some time today is talking about the setup of all the base textures for our little dumpster. I mentioned last week, as we're going through the modeling stage of our dumpster, we always want to start thinking about who actually created this dumpster. If we get into the mindset of the original engineer and the original fabricator, we have kind of a better idea as to how this object should look, okay? So if you were the original fabricator, what did you make this object out of? It's metal, right? So the base material of this object is metal. Now after we make the darn thing, so they welded it all together, then where does it go? What's the next layer in the surface? Probably some paint, right? So we have metal on the base, and we have paint on top, and then what's the third layer that's going to be on top of the paint? Chrome, stickers, detail objects that's going to give it some branding elements and some unique identifiers. That's kind of the same process that we want to replicate when we're going through the texturing phase. We need to figure out the base material, then we're going to layer some paint on, and then we're going to layer some decals on. So the first thing that we're going to start with is the layering of our base material. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to look to find a really nice metal texture initially. Now I've scoured the web, I've gone onto our favorite resource, CG Textures, and I've already downloaded some metal textures that I want to use. Let's find one here that could work. Let's see. Let's find a cool metal texture that will work. I got some faves in here. All right. Let me zip down to the areas that I think I stored all my favorites. All right. Somewhere in here. Now that's not a bad contender. I like this one. What I'm trying to avoid is a perfectly polished piece of metal. I want to bring to the surface some of those lovely character moments in the rust and the dirt and the scratches. So try really hard not to find something that looks perfect. That's a little bit too grungy for our base metal. But now we're getting into something that's compelling. So this is like too perfect. This galvanized section is too perfect. I want something that looks, yeah, here we go. Now we're talking. Now this one has some scratches in it. This is a little bit too light in value for me. But I love the scratches. Now this is what I'm talking about. This is a good texture here for the most part. I like working with textures like this because it gives us some really nice detail on what the base looks like, but it also gives us some really cool character moments for, you know, dirt and scratch and rust and things like that. Okay, it's not perfect, but it's not completely grungy as well. And all of these, and I mean all of these were downloaded from CG Texture, so I'm not pulling these from a resource you guys don't have access to. So let me open up that texture file and import it into my Photoshop network. Drag and drop it. Okay, so now it's in Photoshop. And let's place it into the group that I really want this element to be responsible for. And I think I'm just going to drag good old group number 1 up here towards the top. There we go. And check it out. This is why we spent so much time earlier working with those groups and creating those layer masks. Because now I can simply just take this metal texture and place it inside my group, and it's automatically going to be masked out for us because the group is masked, not individual layers. So I drag it into group number 1, boom, it's already masked out. I got to activate the visibility of group number 1, but there we go. It already matches precisely what we want it to match. Okay. And that's looking pretty good. It's looking really good, actually. Okay. Before we go any further, though, I want to spend a couple moments here talking about some important details that I want you guys to begin looking at. especially when we're working with photographs that we've downloaded from an online resource like CG Textures. We're incorporating photographs into our final texture document that may or may not be correctly scaled to the dumpster that we're working with, okay, or the object that we're working with. It's really apparent when working with wood grain. It's a little bit more difficult to see with working with metallic objects, okay? So just be careful. We want to make sure that the details of the actual photograph match the rough kind of size and scale of the object that we're placing them on. So really noticeable things like this, okay? Like these big rust blobs and some of these gigantic scratches that are running down, in here. If those are really gigantic, it's going to feel out of place. So we got to look at the details of the photograph and ensure that we're not getting any sort of funky duplication or replication inside the actual object. So just look at the details, okay? Let me show you a really extreme example so you guys can get a feel of what I'm talking about. I want to import in another texture here. If I can remember what the name of it is. Oh, that's a good one. That's a delicious one. Ah, that's a good one. Okay, so here's kind of a cool rusty paint photograph. It's a great one. Once you start doing textures for a living, you'll start looking at textures, or you'll start looking at photographs much, much different, okay? So I just dragged that photograph into group number 1, and it automatically was masked out for that group, okay? That's the power of those group masks. I can very quickly add content, and it's automatically to mask it for me. But look at the details of this photograph in comparison to the size of my dumpster. Does it look off? Yeah, the rust scratches in here are just ginormous, right? So we just can't, go grab these textures willy-nilly and just throw them on our textures. We have to use our eyeballs. We have to use our eyeballs, okay? If we don't, we're going to get we're going to reproduce texture detail that's inaccurate, a reproduction that's just going to be flat out wrong, okay? So look carefully. Now, luckily for us, fixing some of these problems is easy, right? If I wanted to keep this texture and include it in my final document, what would I need to do? Shrink it down. Yeah, absolutely. Shrink it down. I'm not going to keep mine because I want to control how all of these details are being created in our scene, okay? You know me, I'm a control freak. I want to be able to control where I place that next layer above it, right? So I have my base material layer selected. It's in there. Got this cool metallic texture. Rock and roll. Things are looking good. Now I want to be able to control what color the paint layer is, right? I don't want to use a photograph for the paint layer. I want to be able to paint that. Now there's a couple ways that we can do this quickly. I want to show you the power way of doing it, right? Because I want to create the illusion that this object was painted and then it was kind of worn out in certain areas, like it was scratched and there's gouges in the paint and we're seeing through to this base metallic layer below, okay? It's really easy to do this. And I also want to be able to control the color of it, okay? I don't want to rely on a photograph because we don't get so much love and control with a photograph, okay? Check this action out. It's really easy to do this. We're going to create a solid color layer, and I'm a big fan of solid color layers. You can add a solid color layer into your Photoshop document by going down to the bottom of the screen and clicking on this little circle, kind of the yin and the yang circle. And at the top of this list, you'll see an option called solid color. Okay? And what this is going to do is automatically flood that entire layer with a solid. Okay? You can see the icon floating down over here in our layers palette. Oops, excuse me. Here's the icon for it. So let's just pick a green that's similar to the green that we want to have. Maybe, I don't know. See, the original dumpster is kind of a grayish, steely green. Yeah, I'm happy with that. That's close